Sarah spent the afternoon arranging her modest furniture in the living room, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass panels, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the hardwood floors. She had purchased the bungalow for $20,000 below market value, a miracle in this sought-after neighborhood, and couldn't believe her luck. The elderly seller, Mrs. Abernathy, had seemed particularly pleased to hand over the keys to Sarah rather than other interested parties, though she hadn't elaborated further. After hauling in the last box from her car, Sarah collapsed onto her porch swing with a glass of lemonade, admiring the quiet tree-lined street. Most of the homes in Oak Ridge Estates were newer constructions with similar facades, making her vintage bungalow stand out like a beloved antique amid mass-produced replicas. A woman walking a golden retriever waved cheerfully and introduced herself as Diane from 3 doors down. "We're so glad someone young is moving in," Diane said warmly. Mrs. Abernathy was a neighborhood fixture for decades. "This house has such character. I was afraid some developer would tear it down and build another McMansion." As they chatted, Diane's expression shifted slightly when Gerald Thornton's name came up. "He's dedicated to neighborhood standards," she said carefully. "Been HOA president for 8 years running. Unopposed, if you can believe it." Sarah thought little of this until the following morning when she found Gerald standing at the edge of her property, coffee mug in hand, studying her front yard with unusual intensity. He wore pressed khakis despite the early hour, his silver hair immaculately combed. "Good morning," Sarah called out, startling him from his thoughts. Gerald approached with mechanical precision, extending a hand that gripped hers too firmly. "Gerald Thornton, HOA president. I trust Mrs. Abernathy explained our community standards." His eyes darted past her to examine the porch railing where paint had begun to peel. "She mentioned there was an association." "Yes," Sarah replied, uncomfortable under his scrutiny. "I have the welcome packet somewhere in my moving boxes." Gerald produced a folder from seemingly nowhere. "The updated bylaws. The previous version you received is outdated." He tapped a section highlighted in yellow. "Particular attention to exterior modifications. All changes require board approval. That means my approval, before commencing work." Sarah accepted the folder with a polite smile. "I'm just painting the interior for now, but thanks for letting me know." Something flickered across Gerald's face. Disappointment. "Your southeast property stake appears to be incorrectly placed," he said abruptly. "The association will need to verify the boundary lines." "The property was surveyed during the purchase," Sarah replied, confused by his fixation. "Everything checked out fine." Gerald's smile didn't reach his eyes. Previous surveys have been known to contain inconsistencies, particularly for this property. He glanced at his watch. The monthly HOA meeting is Thursday evening. Attendance is strongly encouraged for new residents. As he walked away, Sarah noticed how he paused at the sidewalk to take a photo of her house with his phone. Later that day, while unpacking kitchen boxes, she glimpsed him through the window, walking slowly past her property for the 3rd time, speaking intently into his phone. That night, Sarah found a letter in her mailbox. Not a welcome note, but a printed reminder about garbage can placement regulations, proper mailbox heights, and approved exterior paint colors. At the bottom, handwritten in precise block letters, "Historical preservation of original structures is mandatory. No exceptions." Sarah tossed the letter onto her counter, chalking it up to an overzealous HOA president. She had no idea it was the opening move in a battle that had been brewing for 50 years. 2 weeks after moving in, Sarah arrived home from work to find a business card tucked into her doorframe. "Heritage Home Inspections" was printed in gold lettering, with a handwritten note on the back. "Second inspection required. Contact our office to reschedule." She hadn't scheduled a first inspection, let alone missed a second one. When she called the company, the receptionist had no record of any appointment at her address. "That's strange," the woman said. "The only Oak Ridge property in our system this month is for a Gerald Thornton." He's having us document historical features of several properties for the neighborhood association." Sarah hung up, a knot forming in her stomach. That evening, while gardening in her front yard, she watched Gerald escort a young man in a suit through the neighborhood, pointing at various houses. When they reached her property, Gerald gestured emphatically at her roofline and original brick chimney. The man took notes on a tablet. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, setting down her trowel. "Can I help you with something?" Gerald straightened his posture. "Just conducting the annual architectural review. This is Marcus from the County Historical Society." The young man looked confused. "Historical Society? I'm from Capital Realty Group. Mr. Thornton called about potentially listing some properties. Properties that might become available due to code compliance issues," Gerald interrupted sharply. "A routine HOA matter." After they left, Sarah installed a doorbell camera and motion-activated lights. The very next morning, her camera captured Gerald measuring her front porch steps at 5:43 a.m., meticulously writing in a small notebook. 3 days later, she received a certified letter citing her for non-conforming porch dimensions, with a demand to restore original proportions within 30 days. Sarah brought the letter to a contractor for advice. He laughed when he read it. "These are the original dimensions, down to the inch. I worked on Mrs. Abernathy's porch myself 5 years ago. We had to get special permission to maintain the historical measurements instead of updating to current code." When Sarah mentioned this at the next HOA meeting, Gerald dismissed her concerns. "The board has documentation indicating unauthorized modifications to the structure dating back to 1973. "Can I see this documentation?" Sarah asked. "Association records are only available to members in good standing," he replied with a thin smile. "Your recent violations have suspended your access privileges." Walking home from the meeting, Sarah's neighbor Elaine hurried to catch up with her. "Listen," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "Gerald's behavior isn't normal, even for him. My husband and I have lived here 8 years, and we've seen him target people before, but nothing like this." "Why me?" Sarah asked. "I don't know, but he's been asking odd questions about your house. When it was built, who owned the land originally? He even asked if anyone knew where Mrs. Abernathy's family records might be stored." Elaine hesitated. "There's something else. Yesterday, I saw someone in your backyard when you were at work. I thought it was a maintenance person until they ducked behind your shed when a car drove by. It looked like Gerald, but I couldn't swear to it." That night, Sarah checked her property thoroughly before bed. Everything seemed normal until she reached the back corner of her yard, where a surveyor's stake had been hammered into the ground, one that hadn't been there the day before. Attached was a small laminated card. "Notice of boundary dispute. See HOA bylaw 17.3. When she looked up the referenced bylaw, it didn't exist in her copy of the rules. Increasingly uneasy, Sarah double-checked her doors and windows before turning in, unaware that someone was parked down the street, watching her home through binoculars. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. After finding the mysterious survey stake, she contacted her real estate attorney, Marissa Chen, who agreed to review her property documents. "Bring everything," Marissa advised. "Deed, title insurance, disclosure statements, even the home inspection. If something's off, we'll find it." While gathering the paperwork, Sarah discovered a faded manila envelope tucked inside her closing binder. Inside was a handwritten note from Mrs. Abernathy. "Should troubles arise with neighbors regarding property lines, you'll need these." Beneath it lay yellowed newspaper clippings and court documents from 1973. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the headline. "Thornton v. Williams property dispute settles after 3-year battle." The article detailed how Gerald's father, Richard Thornton, had claimed that half of what was now Sarah's property had been wrongfully incorporated into the Williams estate, Mrs. Abernathy's maiden name, through fraudulent survey manipulation in the 1940s. The county judge had ruled firmly against the Thorntons, citing overwhelming evidence that the Williams family has rightfully owned and occupied the disputed parcel since 1932. Richard Thornton had appealed twice and lost both times, eventually bankrupting himself through legal fees. One photograph showed a young Richard Thornton pointing angrily at Sarah's house, while a woman, presumably Mrs. Abernathy's mother, stood defiantly on the porch. The caption read, "Thornton vows to reclaim what's rightfully ours despite court ruling." When Sarah met with Marissa, the attorney examined the documents with growing concern. "This explains a lot," she said, spreading the papers across her desk. "The Thornton family has been trying to claim your land for 3 generations." Marissa pulled up county records on her computer. "Look at this. Gerald Thornton has filed 5 separate property line adjustment requests since becoming HOA president, each one attempting to shift the boundary markers of your lot by small increments." "Can he do that?" Sarah asked. "No. Each was rejected because he has no standing. But he's persistent." Marissa pointed to another screen. "He's also attempted to purchase your property multiple times, once when Mrs. Abernathy's husband died, again when she had medical issues, and most recently when she moved to assisted living. She rejected all offers." "Why didn't my realtor mention this?" Sarah asked. "Because Gerald was careful. He created an LLC called Oak Ridge Heritage Properties to make the offers. Nobody would connect it to him unless they dug deep." Marissa tapped the court documents, but Mrs. Abernathy knew exactly who was behind it. That evening, Sarah examined her property with new eyes. The garden shed that Gerald kept complaining about sat directly on what would have been the disputed boundary line. The heritage oak tree he claimed violated setback requirements stood exactly where the property line had been contested. While taking measurements of her backyard, Sarah noticed something odd about the brick patio. One section didn't match the rest. She pried up a loose brick to find a metal box containing a hand-drawn map of her property with a note. Original survey stakes remained beneath the rose bushes, maple tree, and garden fountain. "Do not allow removal under any circumstances. EU." As Sarah replaced the brick, her phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. "Found something interesting in the county archives about your property. Meet me at the library tomorrow. Elaine." Across the street, Gerald watched from his darkened study as Sarah's kitchen light went out. He opened a worn folder labeled Williams Property Recovery and added a note to his timeline. Phase 1 complete. Legal reclamation proceeding is scheduled. Sarah arrived at the library 10 minutes early, nervously scanning the quiet reading room for Elaine. Instead, an older woman with silver-streaked hair approached her table. "You must be Sarah," she said in a hushed voice. "I'm Margaret Reynolds, County Records Administrator. Elaine asked me to meet you. She thought it's safer this way." "Safer?" Sarah echoed. Margaret glanced around before sliding a USB drive across the table. "Gerald Thornton has been a regular visitor to our archives for 20 years. Last week, several historical property documents went missing after his visit, all related to your address." Sarah inserted the drive into her laptop. The screen filled with digitized documents. Property surveys from the 1930s, the original deed to her home, and photographs of land parcels before development. The Thornton and Williams properties were originally one estate, Margaret explained. When divided in 1932, the Thorntons received the smaller portion due to a gambling debt. They've never accepted it. One document particularly caught Sarah's attention, a map showing underground water lines installed in 1962. A handwritten note indicated a main water shutoff valve was located beneath her driveway, controlling water flow to several surrounding properties, including Gerald's. "That might explain yesterday's incident," Sarah murmured. "What incident?" Margaret asked sharply. "City water workers showed up claiming they needed emergency access to my property. When I asked for identification, they left quickly. They had an Oak Ridge maintenance truck, but something felt off." Margaret's expression darkened. "The city doesn't have an Oak Ridge maintenance division." Those weren't city workers. As they parted, Margaret pressed a business card into Sarah's hand. "If anything happens, anything at all, call me directly." That night, Sarah awoke to the sound of running water. Her kitchen floor was covered in an inch of water that seemed to be seeping up through the foundation. When emergency plumbers arrived, they discovered someone had tampered with the main water line where it entered her property, the exact location shown in the historical documents. "This wasn't an accident," the lead plumber said, pointing to a cleanly cut pipe. "Someone knew exactly what they were doing." The water damage required Sarah to relocate temporarily. As she packed an overnight bag, a certified letter arrived containing what appeared to be legal documents. Notice of Historical Covenant Enforcement on official-looking HOA letterhead, claiming her property was subject to a reversionary interest clause that enabled the HOA to reclaim the property under certain conditions, which she had allegedly violated. Sarah immediately forwarded the documents to Marissa, who called within minutes. "This is complete fabrication," the attorney said angrily. "There is no such covenant on your property. The letterhead looks official, but I checked with the secretary of the HOA board. They never authorized this." "What's Gerald's end game here?" Sarah asked. "I think he's trying to scare you into selling," Marissa replied, "or create enough supposed violations that he can make a case for HOA foreclosure." Later that day, Sarah discovered someone had applied for building permits in her name, renovation plans she never authorized. The application included detailed blueprints for converting her bungalow into a historic recreation of the original Thornton homestead. When she confronted the permit office, the clerk seemed confused. "The HOA president submitted these on your behalf. He had a signed authorization form." "I never signed anything," Sarah insisted. The clerk pulled out the form. The signature was a reasonable forgery of Sarah's name, but clearly not authentic. Outside the permit office, Sarah spotted Gerald's silver Mercedes parked across the street. He wasn't even trying to hide his surveillance anymore. As their eyes met, he gave her a cold smile before driving away. The community center buzzed with unusual energy as residents filed in for the monthly HOA meeting. Word had spread about Sarah's ongoing battles with Gerald, drawing a record attendance. Sarah arrived early, setting up her laptop and projector with Marissa beside her for legal support. Gerald entered with military precision at exactly 7:00 p.m., his HOA binder bulging with tabs and sticky notes. He faltered momentarily upon seeing Sarah's technical setup, but recovered quickly, tapping his gavel with practiced authority. "Before we address new business," Gerald announced after routine matters concluded, "I must inform the community about ongoing compliance issues with the Williams property at 412 Oak Ridge Lane." Sarah noticed his deliberate use of the previous owner's name rather than hers, another subtle way of delegitimizing her ownership. The historical covenant violations have escalated to the point where the board must consider exercising its reclamation rights. Gerald continued, distributing a document titled Bylaw Enforcement, Case for Property Reversion. Marissa stood. "Point of order. As Mize Miller's attorney, I request the floor before any vote occurs." Gerald's jaw tightened. Legal representation is unnecessary for standard HOA proceedings. It becomes necessary when forgery, fraud, and criminal trespassing are involved. Marissa replied evenly, her voice carrying throughout the room. A murmur rippled through the audience. Gerald banged his gavel. "These accusations are inappropriate and potentially slanderous." "Then you won't mind if we present evidence before any vote occurs," Sarah said, stepping to the projector. "In the interest of transparency." Before Gerald could object, Sarah displayed a timeline of events beginning with her purchase and ending with the waterline sabotage. She methodically presented photographs, security footage, and expert assessments, including the plumber's affidavit confirming deliberate tampering. "The pattern becomes clear when you add historical context," Sarah explained, revealing court documents from the original property dispute. "This isn't about HOA violations. This is about a personal vendetta spanning 3 generations." The room fell silent as Sarah displayed side-by-side comparisons of Gerald's handwriting and the forged documents. The county prosecutor's office has confirmed these are forgeries, likely by the same hand. Margaret Reynolds stood from the audience. As county records administrator, I can confirm that historical documents relating to this property disappeared following Mr. Thornton's visit to our archives. Some of these documents, which I fortunately had digitized, directly contradict claims in Mr. Thornton's proposal today. Gerald's face flushed crimson. This is an orchestrated attack on my character. The Williams property has always been rightfully Thornton land. The Williams property, Sarah repeated. You mean my property, Mr. Thornton. The property I legally purchased, that was legally owned by Mrs. Abernathy for 40 years, that your family lost any claim to in 1973. We never lost claim, Gerald shouted, his careful facade crumbling completely. That judge was corrupt. My father spent his life trying to reclaim what was stolen from us. I promised him on his deathbed I would restore our legacy. The HOA vice president, a retired judge named Howard Banks, slowly stood. Gerald, are you admitting to creating false documents, damaging Ms. Miller's property, and misusing HOA authority to pursue a personal claim? Gerald looked around the room, suddenly aware of the shocked faces staring back at him. In the heavy silence, the sound of his HOA binder slapping closed echoed like a judge's gavel. This meeting is adjourned, Gerald announced shakily, heading for the exit. Actually, Howard replied, blocking his path, I believe we have a motion on the floor to discuss immediate removal of the HOA president. 3 months after the explosive HOA meeting, Sarah sat on her fully restored front porch, enjoying the crisp autumn air. The water damage had been repaired, her original hardwood floors salvaged, and the garden replanted with heirloom varieties that matched the home's historical character. The neighborhood had transformed as dramatically as her house. The forensic audit of HOA finances had revealed shocking misappropriations. Gerald had diverted funds for historical research to pay private investigators who tracked Mrs. Abernathy to her nursing home. He had used community landscaping money to hire the fake utility workers who damaged Sarah's water line. Most disturbing was the discovery of a detailed reclamation timeline on his personal computer, outlining a 5-year plan to force Sarah out and acquire her property through a shell company. The civil case against Gerald had concluded swiftly, with the judge ordering full restitution for damages plus punitive penalties. The criminal charges were still pending, but Gerald's attorney was negotiating a plea deal that would likely include probation and community service. As part of the settlement, Gerald was required to sell this house and relocate outside the county. More lemonade? Asked Elaine, who had become a close friend during the ordeal. Please, Sarah replied, watching children play freely in front yards that had once been subject to Gerald's oppressive aesthetic standards. Howard Banks, now serving as interim HOA president, crossed the street to join them. Wonderful news, he announced. The county has officially recognized your home as a historical landmark. No one can ever alter its essential character or boundaries now. Sarah smiled. Mrs. Abernathy would be pleased. Speaking of whom, Howard said, handing Sarah an envelope. This arrived at the community center addressed to you. Inside was a letter postmarked from Arizona, written in elegant cursive. Dear Sarah, news travels, even to retirement communities in the desert. My granddaughter showed me the article about your victory over Gerald Thornton. I must confess something. I deliberately chose you as the buyer for my beloved home. When Gerald's company made their final offer, significantly above yours, I recognized the same tactics his father had used against my parents. The Thornton men never understood that some things aren't for sale, especially family legacy. Your application mentioned restoring the original features rather than modernizing. I knew then you were the right guardian for a home that has weathered 3 generations of Thornton schemes. The garden shed contains one last surprise. Look beneath the floorboards. The original land grant documents are there, along with letters between the first Thornton and Williams patriarchs. They were once dear friends before ambition soured their relationship. Perhaps this cycle of enmity can finally end. With gratitude, Eleanor Abernathy Williams. That evening, neighbors gathered in Sarah's backyard for the community's first preservation celebration. Howard presented Sarah with a plaque commemorating her role in preserving not just historical property, but community integrity. The new HOA charter, drafted with Sarah's input, emphasized homeowner rights alongside reasonable maintenance standards. As twilight settled, Sarah noticed a young couple touring Gerald's empty house across the street. The real estate agent pointed toward Sarah's home, saying something that made them smile and nod enthusiastically. Later, Sarah discovered they were historical architecture professors who specialized in restoring vintage homes. They became not just neighbors but partners in documenting the neighborhood's rich history, including the infamous Thornton-Williams dispute that would eventually feature in the local historical society's permanent exhibition. Boundaries, the lines that define community. The final irony came 6 months later when county surveyors, updating property records, discovered that Gerald's own property line had been incorrectly drawn for decades. His meticulously maintained backyard, which had won Best Landscape for 8 consecutive years, actually encroached 6 inches onto community land, the very infraction he had cited against numerous homeowners during his reign as HOA president.